What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. Pokemon types are as important to defining what they're all about as much as their name or original design aspects. A trick that we figured out early on is combining different types, resulting in various strengths and weaknesses that can either help or hinder a Pokemon in general. And as many combinations as there are, not all possible type pairings have even been represented yet. But also certain distinct Pokemon have a type combination that is completely unique from anyone else. Now sometimes that can make a Pokemon almost unbeatable, and other times it's kind of a letdown. But in determining the best and worst, it's not as easy as checking good versus bad, especially in considering unique type combinations. The individual Pokemon has to be taken into account. Take Tyranitar. It's literally got just as many weaknesses as it does strengths. On paper, that's not so great, but thanks to its stats and moves, it's a force to be reckoned with. So the Pokemon itself has to be taken into consideration. So, with that, here are the top 6 best and worst unique typings in Pokemon. Number 6 worst, Claydol. I don't really have anything against Claydol personally. It's an interesting design concept, and in fact I used one once, but honestly that experience was mixed as well. It's got decent defenses and does have a fair amount of coverage, but somehow putting all that together just results in mediocrity. Claydol has 6 weaknesses, with 4 resistances and an immunity. Now, I know what you're saying. Isn't Claydol immune to ground as well? Yes, technically it is, but that's because it has the ability Levitate. For some reason, they seem to go kind of crazy with Gen 3 and Levitate. So, while the only ground and psychic Pokemon are immune to ground attacks right now, that's not inherent to the combination itself, and really doesn't help all that much. Part of the drawbacks for Claydol is that this specific blend does nothing in the way of canceling weaknesses, and every single one carries over to the finished product. Part of that is simply because the Psychic type is pretty bad defensively, resisting only fighting and itself. So while it may have just as many strikes for it as it does against it, when you stack them all beside each other, it just feels like Claydol's weaknesses are going to be more common on the opponent's teams. Even with Claydol's admittedly good move pool, about half of it is weird utility moves. And unfortunately those moves aren't entirely backed up by raw stats. Meaning while this Pokemon is arid and elevated, it's literally left high and dry. So again, Claydol itself isn't that terrible, but rather just doesn't bring its type pairing to its fullest potential. Number 6 best, Ludicolo. I've gone on record before on how Ludicolo sneakily became a Pokemon that I really liked, so I was glad to see that it and its line seem to have enough of an impact to make an appearance on this list as well. It seems the starting type combinations, together, balance out a great deal of strengths and weaknesses. But when we look at the end results of each of the starting type matchups side by side, we can see that of all of their weaknesses, Ludicolo seems to have the best advantages. Poison, Flying, and Bug seem relatively infrequent compared to the likes of Electric or Rock. And Ludicolo can learn moves to counter such weaknesses as well. Not to mention that it's the only one not weak to Stealth Rocks, and has some really great resistances. Water and Grass just seems to be a surprisingly useful type pairing, bringing up most of the game to neutral status, with this happy, dancing, pineapple, bird bath, tree, duck. Man, this thing has a lot going on. Anyway, this eclectic Pokemon has decent stats and a vast enough move pool to be useful in all sorts of scenarios. And thanks to its abilities, it's a powerful staple on many a rain team in competitive play. All this leads me to conclude that the entire Ludicolo family not only has a pretty great unique typing, but also somewhat surprisingly has the clout to back it up. Number 5 worst, Alolan Raticate. Raticate suffers from being a later stage of a Pokemon that people get pretty sick of early on due to overexposure. But unlike, say, Crobat that can grow past that, the ugly little rat is not so lucky. Then, perhaps to make up for that, they received Alolan forms for their line, which was a decent idea, but the execution didn't really do it a lot of favors. Normal and Dark is an interesting combination. I mean, if you're gonna get all the type combinations out there, you've got to have someone use it eventually. But just look at the facts. We know Standard Normal. It's got a weakness to fighting and a ghost immunity, and that's it. When the Dark type is added, it does provide a resistance to Dark, and also another immunity to Psychic. And it's still got that immunity to Ghost. But then you see that it also gets a weakness to Bug and Fairy, and that its fighting weakness is ratcheted up to ×4. That doesn't sound so bad. 3 weaknesses and 3 resistances, 2 of which are actually immunities. But the thing about Alolan forms is that they reconfigured some of the stats, but didn't increase any of them. So for Alolan Raticate, they took a cut in both attacks and speed and put it in defense and HP, which is a profusely misguided decision if you ask me. I mean, the Alolan form does get some potential setup moves, but with a ×4 weakness to fighting, a type with many high-powered attacks, and Pokemon strength through the roof, your chubby little Raticate isn't going to last. Not to mention that having very little ways of countering any of its actual weaknesses makes me think that the Alolan Raticate might just be one of the few Pokemon to have regional variants become a detriment. Number 5 best, Toxicroak. I was honestly surprised by Toxicroak making it onto this list at all, but I'm actually glad that it did, to give it a small moment in the spotlight. Croagunk and Toxicroak are some cool poisonous frogs that have enhanced combat skills. They are the only poison and fighting types to date. Toxicroak has 6 resistances, along with 3 weaknesses. It does resist both of its own attacking types, as well as rock, so stealth rocks are not a problem. Now, it is the only Pokemon to have a quad weakness to the Psychic type, but really that's not as big a problem as you might think, since Psychic is fairly scarce as a coverage move outside of its native type. And even then, Toxicroak has access to a number of Dark and Ghost moves to take them out, including Priority Sucker Punch. I did consider Salazzle for this spot, but looking at the numbers, while it does have a few different resistances, it also has an extra type weakness, as well as its own quad susceptibility to worry about. Not to mention, though it does have stupendous special attack and speed, that's about all it has of note. And Toxicroak has 10 more points in its base stat total. So out of the frankly impressive number of poison types with unique combinations, I believe the Toxicroak line to come out with the best deal. When I first saw these two before the Sinnoh games came out, I was skeptical that they were even real, let alone that they'd be any good. But I was quite stunned with the results. After getting pummeled by Toxicroak via Team Galactic, we got to see firsthand just how strong this unassuming unique type pair of poison and fighting can really be. Number 4 worst, Magcargo. I know what you might be thinking. This is the first entry on the worst list where the resistances are actually outweighed by the weaknesses, so what gives? Well, just looking at this Pokemon, it's not all bad, other than it being hotter than the sun. But as you can see, this Pokemon is reminiscent of a snail, so as such it is very slow. The shell, of course, drastically increases the defenses from the first stage, but this is where the strengths and weaknesses come in. Magcargo is the only fire and rock type in the Pokemon games. This gives it up to 7 resistances, but it does have 4 weaknesses. But 2 of those are quad weaknesses. Magcargo is 4 times weak to both water and ground, so it's got a fair amount of worst nightmares out there to worry about. Its only possible hope for defense in that is Solar Beam, but there's no way it'll survive that charge-up turn. Other than that, its move pool is fairly narrow, with only some ground moves as possible help against other weaknesses. Outside of that, this painfully slow Pokemon is completely at the mercy of its 2 quad weaknesses that are very common attacking types. Water is literally the most common type in the game. So if you're under the delusion that you can avoid them, or even worse, that you might ever outspeed them, you really need to think again. Magcargo was dealt such an unfortunate hand that I honestly think the only reason it still has a unique typing is because that they're too scared to make another fire rock type in case it turns out just as bad. Number 4 best, Bisharp. This is another one that kind of snuck up on me. I've always liked Bisharp. It's solidly in my second tier of Unova Pokemon. And it still has a unique typing with Dark and Steel. Honestly, I'm surprised that it took them so long to do it in the first place, since those 2 types were both introduced back in Gen 2. But Bisharp's typing truly is a benefit since Steel is quite defensive on its own, and luckily just so happens to cancel out 2 of the Dark type's natural weaknesses. This leaves it with 9 resistances and 2 immunities to Psychic and Poison. This thing would be Team Rocket's enemy number 1. That being said, it does have weaknesses to Fire, Ground, and a 4x weakness to Fighting. This isn't exactly the best setup for weaknesses, since they are all fairly common and often powerful. But while Bisharp does have access to some Rock-type moves to handle the Fire, it's got precious few other options against that crippling fighting disadvantage. However, if you can count your biggest problems on one hand, you're still doing alright. Especially when you have to enlist your toes to complete the names of your strengths. Dark and Steel combined hit a lot of things neutrally at least, so Bisharp is able to utilize that 125 in attack very well. And considering that it's able to resist things like Dragon, it is certainly a good counter Pokemon to have, particularly in its home region before the advent of the Fairy type. Bisharp may have been one of those Pokemon created just to check off the Dark-Steel combination box, but its usefulness and just downright threatening design make this unique pairing all the sweeter to use when stomping out opponents. Number 3 worst, Aurorus. If this entry doesn't convince you that this isn't based on personal preference, nothing will, because I absolutely love Aurorus. It's a beautiful, majestic Brontosaurus with ice powers. What's not to love? It's one of my favorite fossil Pokemon to date. Unfortunately, its typing does it no favors because, as it turns out, Ice and Rock is pretty atrocious. Somebody had to take the hit and beat this combination first, just to see how it would turn out, but let's just look. It does have 4 resistances, so that's good, but it also has 6 weaknesses, 2 of which are ×4 weaknesses. If you get anywhere near this thing with a Fighting or Steel move, it will just instantly crumble. And you might think that at least 4 resistances aren't bad, but the first 2 are Poison and Normal, which, okay. Another is Flying, but I don't know who's going to use a Flying type against a Pokemon with Stab, Rock, and Ice moves. And the last, of course, is Ice. And while it can take out some of its own weaknesses with the Ice, it really has nothing much for the rest, and precious few options against its dual quad weaknesses. Pair that with its low speed, and even its high HP and special attack aren't enough to save it. Believe me, I wish this Tundra Pokemon was better suited for battle. And that's not to say that it can't be used effectively. I used one in my second playthrough of Kalos and quite enjoyed it, but that didn't stop it from dying more than I would have liked. Honestly, I can't see them ever attempting this combination again, unless they just really have a stellar idea for the design and crank the stats up to the max, because Ice and Rock together leaves a lot to be desired. Number 3 best, Mimikyu. Mimikyu is on yet another list. Can't say I'm surprised, but let's just take a look. We know that Ghost only has 2 weaknesses, and Fairy also only has 2 weaknesses. And with Mimikyu being the only Ghost Fairy Pokemon, it gets to have the best of both. And as it happens, the Ghost cancels out the Poison, and the Fairy cancels out the Dark, leaving Mimikyu with only 2 weaknesses. That alone is probably enough to get it on the list by itself, but we haven't even gotten to resistances. This combination results in 3 immunities to Normal, Fighting, and Dragon. It also results in a ×4 resistance to Bug, which might as well be a 4th immunity. This unique typing is pretty great, having more immunities than weaknesses, but when you remember that Mimikyu has one of the best abilities in the game with Disguise, it really makes the only Ghost Fairy type a Pokemon that has almost too many advantages and little, if any, downsides. Number 2 worst, Crabominable. Crabominable is just the worst. It's one of my biggest problems with the Alola region to date, and it just really was a big letdown for poor Crabrawler. But not only is its design questionable, its typing also drops it down a few pegs. After leveling up this feisty crab in the snow, it becomes much worse off. It does have 3 resistances, but it also doubles that in weaknesses, with a total of 6. Yeah, that's not so great. Crabominable resists Dark and Ice, which is good and can be taken out by fighting. but then also Bug, which isn't exactly the most threatening of types to worry about. I would say that it has a chance to take out some of its weaknesses with its stab attacks, but its pitiful speed stat of 43 doesn't lend to making that a reality. It actually got slower when it evolved, which is really a shame to waste its massive attack, but it truly is a waste on a Pokemon that has such a terrible combination of types, resulting in it being weak to literally a third of the game with almost nothing to show for it. Crabominable having twice as many negatives as it does positives just makes this already questionably designed Pokemon that much more of a hassle to try and use. Maybe the first Sun and Moon had the right intentions in mind, sparing us from being able to use this Pokemon until the very end of the game, because we would have been better off without it. Number 2 best, Empoleon. Anyone who's been keeping track will probably not be surprised. Empoleon is my favorite Pokemon of all time. But that's not the only reason that it's here, because Water and Steel is a solid typing on its own. Empoleon does have 3 weaknesses, but it's also got 10 resistances and an immunity to poison. And when it first debuted, it also resisted Ghost and Dark before Steel randomly lost its defenses to those 2 types. Probably from the ultimate weapon and Infinity Energy? That's my guess anyway. Now, some people might be saying that Empoleon sucks because it can get O-code by the other 2 starters in its native games. But that's not its fault that those 2 happen to have 2 of the only 3 types that this Pokemon might be weak to. But it has its own moves to take them out by having access to both Flying and Ice-type moves respectively. Not to mention other tricks like Aqua Jet and Defiant as a hidden ability. And it's one of those coveted few Stealth Rockers and Defog users, for the competitive folks playing at home. Water and Steel may have a few common attacking types as weaknesses, but the sheer boatload of resistances far outweigh that, especially when the sole Pokemon to have this typing is able to handle itself in a fight. The reason I feel Empoleon beats the last 2 entries is because that it has far more resistances than Mimikyu, and can actually handle its weaknesses, unlike Bisharp, and without a ×4. Water and Steel is a pretty amazing combination, and I would be perfectly okay with this typing remaining unique for the rest of time, and this excellent combination stay reserved for this regal penguin. Number 1 worst, Abomasnow. Well, here we are at the bottom of the barrel, and we've found none other than Abomasnow. It's not that I hate Abomasnow, I really don't. In fact, I really appreciate its pre-evolution Snover. And when they were first revealed, I really liked the idea and thought that they did an exquisite job in balancing out these 2 types that seem so at odds with one another in their designs. But as much as I might admire their ability to pull off disparate elements blending together, that alone cannot save it from being a horrendous pairing. Grass and Ice by themselves are often considered very weak types, and combining them together only goes on to highlight this. Abomasnow does have 4 resistances, but also has 7 weaknesses, one of which is a ×4 weakness to fire. Now that alone is not so bad. Bug and Steel Pokemon are also quad weak to fire, but that's the only thing that they have to worry about. They don't have to worry about fighting, poison, flying, bug, rock, and steel on top of that like Abomasnow does. Now remember, as we said before, these placements are determined by actual numbers on type matchups, but also how individual Pokemon are able to handle themselves in battle. And for whatever reason, Abomasnow just tends to get outclassed most of the time. Its only saving grace is that it can learn Earthquake, which could potentially help it against 4 of its weaknesses. And of course it's got Stab Ice to take out Flying, but I'm afraid that just isn't enough. And if you were thinking of using its Mega, don't bother. It actually loses speed, so it's even less likely that you'll be able to survive anything. I've tried using this thing to set up Hail on ice teams, and that's about all it can get done, and really only because of its Snow Warning ability, because it usually dies on the first turn. As beneficial as it might seem to have in theory, Abomasnow is even a liability to other ice types. It is simply too feeble to make use of the few good cards that it has left, and its frailty makes it far too unreliable to ever consistently perform, which to me undoubtedly makes Grass and Ice the worst unique type combination to date. Number 1 best, Aegislash. This haunted sword Pokemon is one of the best in the game, there is no denying. If you don't believe me, just check out the competitive field. Oh wait, you can't because it got banned for being too good. Now this is largely due to its ability Stance Change, which I just realized makes another one that's on both lists. That's really not fair that they keep giving out great abilities to type combinations that are already inherently wickedly strong. Again, if you don't believe me, just take a look at the facts. Aegislash is a Ghost and Steel type, both types that we've already seen on the best side of this list. So it's no surprise that together they would become extreme. Aegislash is weak to Ground, Fire, Ghost, and Dark, which might sound bad until you see that it has 8 resistances and 3 immunities. It's like the best of the last 2 entries combined, matching Mimikyu's immunities, but also sharing Empoleon's cascade of other resistances. But there's even more reasons why I think Aegislash should be number 1. As we've already mentioned, it's got a signature ability that is almost unfair, letting it swap between 2 forms to alternate whether it has sky-high attack or defense, and its own brand of Protect and King Shield. That alone makes it a potent threat, but it can also handle its opponents that would dare to strike it with a weakness. Ghost is a type that's weak to itself, so while Aegislash might be weak to Ghost, it can easily tank those hits and then hit back much harder, even with priority. And it also has the option to learn the powerful fighting move Sacred Sword, which used to be reserved for the legendary Swords of Justice. So I don't think Dark types are going to be much of a problem either. Naturally high stats that can change to fit any occasion due to a masterful ability, powerful stab attacks with wonderful coverage options, and a slew of inherent resistances exceeds any shortcomings that might arise from a few little super effective attacks. That is why I believe Aegislash makes the absolute most of its Ghost Steel typing, and makes it the best unique type combination in Pokemon that we've seen to this day. So, those are the top 6 best and worst unique typings in Pokemon. If you have a problem with the perceived imbalances on this list, such as too many Ice or Steel types on one side or the other, just remember that that's more of a complaint to the people that assigned these matchups to the types in the first place. Which combinations do you think clash or blend with their execution? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And we'll see you around next time!